Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, 50 Years of Protecting Polar Bears, presented by World Wildlife Fund's Manager of Arctic Wildlife, Elisabeth Kruger, and NatHab's Chief Sustainability Officer, Court Whelan. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Court.
Thank you so much, Rob. Welcome, everyone. And as Rob said, there are no slides today, so you're stuck just looking at us the whole time, but that is all intentional. We want this to be a conservation conversation today. We're going to do deep dive, and basically the title is this 50 years of polar bear conservation, but it's really a past, present, and future when it comes to Arctic conservation. And of course, polar bears front and center in that dialogue. So as Rob said, my name is Court. I'm our Chief Sustainability Officer. I'm also an expedition leader. I do a lot of our trips up to Churchill to see polar bears. So I'll be weaving in and out of the conversation in that manner, talking about some of the conservation stuff and some of my anecdotal work with polar bears, showing guests all over the world this very special part of the Arctic and gazing into the eyes of polar bears. But really the star of the show, no pressure, Elizabeth, but the star of the show today is, of course, Elisabeth Kruger, who's the manager of Arctic Wildlife at World Wildlife Fund. And she is really a key player in all things conservation when it comes to World Wildlife Fund's Arctic program. It goes into polar bears and quite a bit beyond that. But rather than do an introduction, I would love to hear Elisabeth talk a little bit about her role, do a little bit of an introduction. So Elisabeth, would you like to start off and tell me a little bit about your role at World Wildlife Fund? How are you involved in the Arctic research and polar bear conservation?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, my title is manager for Arctic Wildlife. And so I lead our conservation work on Arctic marine mammals, particularly in the US, but we have shared ecosystems. And a big one of those is polar bears.
Fantastic. Well, so one of the big impetus for this presentation today is, of course, this 50-year anniversary of the 1973 Agreement on the Conservation of Polar Bears, a pretty momentous change in the mindset of how we manage and work with polar bears. Put yourself 50 years ago and we're in a very, very different situation today. But I thought to help frame the conversation, Elisabeth, I'm going to come back to you. And could you kind of tell me about the current status of polar bears in today's world, just so we're all on the same page of what we're dealing with, what we're working with in today's day and age? Things like, how many bears are in the world? Are they different by country? Are there different subpopulations? Kind of give us an overview of where we're at today with polar bears.
Sure, thanks, Court. So currently today, there's somewhere between 22 and 31,000 polar bears in the world. And a little bit later on, I'll talk about why there's such a broad range in those numbers. Just a little bit of background, there's 19 different subpopulations of polar bears around the Arctic. And here in Alaska, we have 2 of them. And I'll also talk a little bit about those 2 subpopulations. They're responding very differently to climate change in a very interesting way right here in Alaska. And as you mentioned, Court, the current threat to polar bears, as I'm sure everyone is aware, is loss of sea ice habitat caused by climate change. But that hasn't always been the case. Back before 1973, there was a lot of sport and commercial hunting of polar bears for their hides or for trophies. And people were coming in from outside of the Arctic and hunting astounding numbers of polar bears on an annual basis. And we think that their population was pretty drastically reduced at that point. So in 1973, all the polar bear range states, so those are all the countries where polar bears have their habitat within those nations. And those are Russia, Denmark, because of Greenland, Norway, because of Svalbard, the United States, and Canada. All got together and signed a convention and basically solved that problem. They banned the commercial and most trophy and sport hunting of polar bears, and polar bears started to recover because the primary threat was really dealt with from a policy management standpoint. Unfortunately, climate change was just starting to come onto the radar for people at the time, and it wasn't really considered a huge threat in comparison to the hunting. Now, the biggest threat is climate change, and so it's our version of that 1973 crisis, where we're thinking about, as we're seeing this this habitat decline for this for all of these populations, how are we going to do conservation now? How are we bringing people together to really tackle this issue?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. And so obviously climate change is the issue of today with polar bears. It's something I don't think that's going to surprise most people, because they have become this sort of poster child, a canary in the coal mine, if you will, this symbol for conservation of the Arctic, not just conservation of the Arctic, but really conservation of the world because of climate change. But polar bears are uniquely susceptible, are they not? Would you mind chatting a little bit about, why are polar bears a thing they're going to get hit first and hardest? Why are they so susceptible? You have this huge marine bear, Ursus maritimus, topping out at 14, 15, 1,600 pounds as some of the biggest, formidable animal. Why are they so at risk when they are kind of an apex predator in their environment?
Right. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I think polar bears are very susceptible. They're also just a very visible part of the ecosystem. And so these changes are going to be happening at all levels, and already are happening in the Arctic. I live in the Arctic, and we see it on a daily basis. It's things are changing, and they're changing incredibly rapidly. I always go back to the sea ice, and it's one of the most amazing things about the Arctic. It's this inorganic, I mean, everybody knows ice. Everybody interacts with ice, whether it's in your glass or, in the winter, if you're ice skating or something like that. We all know this substance. But in the Arctic, it's a very different thing. And it's the basis of the entire ecosystem. So it forms in the winter, and it expands its extent, and it gets thicker. And then in the dark months, it's getting thicker and thicker. And then in the springtime, the sun starts to come back, and the ice thins a little bit, the snow melts a little bit, and those sun rays are finally able to get through the ice down underneath. And there's this algae that's hanging out underneath that sea ice, and it just goes nuts with doing its photosynthesis. It's getting all that sun, and it's converting that energy of that sun, where we have 24 hours of great sunlight. It's converting all of that energy into life, into what we call primary productivity. And in Alaska, our two of our Arctic seas, the Bering and Chukchi seas, actually have the highest primary productivity in the world. And it's all because of that sea ice that's able to hold on to that algae and give it the platform for engaging with the sun. And then that algae and phytoplankton and all the other tiny stuff kind of filters down and feeds an entire food web, which, if you draw simple lines, you can go from the tiny stuff through to fish, through to seals, and to polar bears. So sea ice is not just a platform. It's not just a thing that polar bears walk on to find seals. It's also this really unique substance that allows for life, even though it is not organic itself.
That's so cool. And so when I learned about this first many years ago, is I look at sea ice almost as if it's like the soil. For those of us that aren't around sea ice all the time, it's like you flip the whole ecosystem upside down, literally. And the sea ice is the soil that grows the seeds, the grasses, and then the herbivores eat the grasses, and then the bigger things eat those, and so on. It's just like that, but upside down. And the ice is that substrate that this algae holds on to them to feed the plankton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then you mentioned, this idea it's not only the platform on which to hunt, and this is something I find is quite fascinating with polar bears, is that they've actually evolved kind of recently in the grand scheme of things. When you think about it, like as a bear, this is sort of a fun fact. If you have not been on one of our polar bear expeditions or haven't read about them too much, is that they actually evolved out of the brown bear, the grizzly. They're very, very closely related. In fact, if you have the two of them breeding with one another, they in certain cases can produce viable offspring, which is kind of a startling concept, because that is what way back in the old school days of like Carolus, Linnaeus, and Darwin, like that would be considered the same species if two can mate and reproduce. And so it's very fascinating. But this idea, just to catch people up on the grave importance of sea ice, not just for regulating the ecosystem and being those grasslands, so to speak, that produce, is essentially grizzlies got locked out on ice during the end of the last ice age, and these bears started to realize there's this huge niche that is it's unexplored. It's not taken advantage of. There's this great saying by a famous biologist that nature abhors a vacuum, and what this vacuum was is all these seals that would consistently every 3 to 5 minutes pop their heads out of these little seal breathing holes. They're also a marine mammal, and these bears gradually figured out a way, instead of spending all spring eating berries and moth caterpillars and salmon when they get at them, they said, you know what, here are these 400 to 600 pound great big chicken nuggets that are going to make us very, very happy and healthy. And so without that platform, polar bears really do have a struggle. And I think that when we think about the possibility of like de-evolution, meaning like, well, if polar bears evolved out of grizzlies so recently, and when I say recently, we're talking about like 300,000 to 6 million years. Like, it's recent, trust me. It doesn't seem like it, but it is. But like, could they devolve? And the reality is like they've grown accustomed to this incredible amount of fat and protein, and their whole morphology has shifted from the way that their teeth look to the way that their heads are formed, and they just simply couldn't get enough calories if they had to revert back to grasses and sedges and caterpillars and grubs and even salmon. In fact, their claws have evolved in a different way to be better at grasping onto that sea ice to pounce and run and so on and so forth. So anyway, it's just a fascinating thing of how important sea ice is. So as Elisabeth was saying, the biggest issue when we think about climate change is a warming environment. It happens way more pronounced at the poles than the equator. We talk about this average of like 2 degrees Celsius change or what projections. It's actually way more exacerbated in the Arctic. It's just the nature of things, is that sea ice is melting, and the polar bears not only no longer have or will have a place to hunt, a platform on which to hunt, but the whole productive ecosystem might shut down, which could impact fisheries and other marine mammals. So it's definitely a big thing, of course. So kind of getting back to you, Elisabeth, we talk about these 5 countries that manage polar bears. They were all part of this 1973 agreement, and they were part of other agreements that have happened since then. How do these different parts of the Arctic respond differently to climate change? Is it all kind of the same thing? I've heard and seen like annual sea ice versus seasonal. Like, kind of give us a little bit of insight on that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that. It's to me, it's fascinating because when we talk about the entire Arctic and all polar bears, climate change just vastly outweighs all the other threats, because it is the habitat, it's loss of habitat that we're talking about. That said, each subpopulation, I talked about the 19 different subpopulations, each one of them exists in a different part of the Arctic where there are different underlying conditions. The ocean is different in those places. And so I gave the example of Alaska, where we have what people call the Chukchi Sea subpopulation, and then we have the Southern Beaufort Sea subpopulation, which we share with Canada. And these two populations are fascinating because they're neighbors here, and they're so far responding very differently to loss of sea ice habitat. And there's a few different hypotheses for why this is happening, but a lot of it comes back to that incredible productivity I was talking about in the Chukchi Sea. And if anyone has looked at a map of Alaska or wants to pull one up on Google, you can see that there's a north coast of Alaska, and off the north, we call it the North Slope. Off the North Slope, there's a little bit of a shallow continental shelf, but it doesn't go very far out. Now, the Chukchi Sea is basically entirely continental shelf, and the Bering Sea also is known for, you know, this shallow and generally shallow ocean has higher productivity, and where it drops off into the deep waters, there's just not as much food there. And so as sea ice is melting on an annual basis, so every spring it starts receding, it's moving, is simplification, but let's say it's moving north. And so every day you lose a little bit more sea ice, you lose a little bit more sea ice. Now, if you're in the Beaufort Sea, you're losing ice at the similar rate to the Chukchi Sea, but today it's no longer over the continental shelf anymore. So it's over deep waters. Whereas these bears over here in the Chukchi Sea, they are at this similar extent, but they're still over shallow waters. So they still have all those seals and all that prey that they can be feeding on. Whereas the Southern Beaufort Sea bears, if they're staying with the ice, they're now over unproductive, or what we think are less productive waters. And so we are seeing a marked difference in the health and we think, although we only have one population estimate that's ever been done for the Chukchi Sea subpopulation, so it's hard to get a trend from one estimate, but there are a lot of other indicators we can use, like body condition, cubs, reproductive rates, things that are that you don't necessarily have to have a count of polar bears to know how the population is doing. And so far in the Chukchi Sea, they are having these fat roly-poly cubs. They're having triplets fairly routinely, it seems like. They're doing overall pretty well. There's another idea about why that might be, and it's also related to the productivity in those seas. So one thing about the ocean is, you know, all that life in there. It's not a terribly, I mean, it's it's good habitat, but animals die out in the wild of various causes. And when whales die, or walrus, or these large animals, they usually wash up on shore. And so if you are a giant whale carcass and you wash up on shore and you still got all your meat and all your fat and everything on you, to a polar bear, that is a buffet. And that's a buffet for, you know, 50 to 100 bears can be sometimes gathering at a single carcass. And the Chukchi Sea is hypothesized to be the one area where those marine mammals that wash up on shore might actually have a sustaining effect at the population level. Whereas in other places, there's just not enough kind of that natural demise because there's not as many animals out there to die and then wash up on sea. So those are a couple differences that illustrate how two neighboring populations that you would think would have similar outcomes.
It seems that Elisabeth has frozen up on us for just a second, Court.
Okay, all good. Well, Elisabeth, if you can hear us, I think your connection may have froze. I'll jump in here and kind of give a little bit of context to some of what she was talking about. So remember, when we're talking about this primary productivity, it all comes down to this idea that the sea ice is this platform to start growing stuff underneath it. And so it's not that the bears are really trying to go directly after the fish, but as you have the little algae and the little fish and eaten by the bigger fish, eventually you're going to get seals. Remember, seals are the primary, pretty much only food source that polar bears are after. There's been some documented cases of them going after things like snow geese. They do eat kelp from time to time. I've actually observed that in the Churchill area, where polar bears will sort of munch on kelp during this fasting period. But keep in mind, as these bears are sort of pushed to shore, either in search of food, like these walrus carcasses that wash up, or like a whale that washes up, it also puts them closer to people. And so when we think about the sort of origins of modern day polar bear conservation with this 1973 agreement, talking about people going into polar bear habitat, hunting polar bears, the opposite is kind of happening right now. And this is something, once Elisabeth jumps back on, I know she's just signing on right now. One thing I want to talk with her about is she's very, very involved in is actually this idea of polar bears coming into human civilization. Now, you could make the argument that we're still kind of encroaching in their habitat, so I don't want to say that it's them encroaching on us. We are in their world. But this idea of human wildlife, oh, there you are, Elisabeth. I was just launching into my next question, which you so perfectly led me into. Oh, and there she is in Alaska at the moment, folks. So bear with us. We'll get her back on. But what I was getting at is I would love to talk with her about the human wildlife conflict issues. Can you see me, Elisabeth? You good?
I can. Apologies,
Okay.
I'm not sure what happened there.
No worries. I was you kind of made the perfect segue for me, because I was talking about this idea that as polar bears come to shore, because walruses and whales have washed up on shore for eons, for millennia. Like that's a very natural thing that's happened. And so polar bears are used to, in times of fasting or famine or just in search of opportunity, they're used to coming to shore. And so one of the big issues that World Wildlife Fund is tackling today, it's a huge conservation issue, but also tremendous opportunity, is this idea of human wildlife conflict, where polar bears and people are coming together in some of these remote villages. And it's a question of how do you deal with them? So that question goes over to you, Elisabeth. What is human wildlife conflict? Anything more you want to talk about how it happens, but most importantly, what is World Wildlife Fund and what is the general conservation angle on mitigating, lessening this conflict? How do you do it?
Yeah, so human wildlife conflict happens all over the world, and
Yep, you're good. Uh-oh, I don't have audio now. Mm-mm.
We seem to have lost your audio, Elisabeth.
Let's see, I can see her working on it. We'll give her just a moment here. Mm-mm.
now?
Oh, yep, there we go.
Okay,
All right.
my devices are trying to be too smart. They're all connected to each other. And now you're frozen.
Oh.
No?
I can hear you. You're frozen on my screen, but I can hear you. Oh, can you hear us,
Okay,
Elizabeth?
I think I can hear you now.
You can always turn off your webcam if maybe the bandwidth is a little bit too high for this.
Yeah, sorry guys, as everyone says, this never happens. Just gonna turn that off for now. Hopefully you can still hear me. Can you remind me of the question, Court?
Yeah, well, so we were talking about polar bears coming to shore in search of feeding opportunities, which has kind of evolved in the last couple of decades into this idea of polar bears and humans coming together a little too close for comfort. What's your work on that? I know that you're deeply immersed in it, as is World Wildlife Fund. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so human wildlife conflict happens all the time. A lot of people on this call have probably experienced it. In the Arctic, there's several different species that people come into conflict with, and one of those is polar bears. And as you mentioned, Court, they do come on shore, and they're also opportunistic feeders. So even though they're really specialized to go after seals, and that's really what they is kind of best suited for them for their nutrition, they'll go after anything that smells like it might be edible. And so they're always, and if you imagine you're out in a white landscape, and everything is white, everything is flat or jumbled up ice. If you see something that's not that, you might go investigate, especially if you're hungry, and especially if you get a whiff of something that that smells kind of tasty. And so this becomes an issue when those things are part of a village or a place where people live. And especially when the things that the polar bear is attracted to are people or the pets or the property or things that the people care about. We have had some really tragic incidents actually this year in Alaska where 2 human lives were lost as a result of a polar bear attack in a village where I've spent quite a bit of time. And so it's a very real issue, and people are very concerned about their safety and the safety of their children. And it's also an issue for polar bears. As more and more polar bears are coming into contact with people, there needs to be a way to keep people safe and also to keep polar bears safe in the process. So in Alaska, I work with communities, and we go, generally it's at the request of the community. So if a community says, we are concerned about polar bears, we're concerned about our children, our safety, and we don't always want to use lethal force on the polar bears. You know, there are instances where we would prefer to use non-lethal, some sort of method. Then that's a place where we can work and we can help bring in all sorts of different tools that have been used in other parts of the Arctic. Some of them are incredibly innovative that other Arctic, especially indigenous communities in Canada or Greenland or Russia have developed, or in Alaska. And I have kind of what I think of as a toolbox of these that we've gathered over time, and can share those with people and say, hey, here's this buffet of things that people have tried. Now, you know your community the best, and what of these things do you think would be most helpful for your goal of keeping yourself safe and not having to put down every bear that is considered to be a threat?
Interesting. Can you give us a few examples of some of those that may have come across in your practice recently?
Yeah, so often there's kind of a spectrum of things. These are called deterrents, and as the name suggests, they're basically supposed to deliver an unpleasant experience to a bear, so that they'll learn to associate unpleasantness with people. And so because it's something that they're not going to like, we try to do the least invasive tools first, and so have a collection of those. And for a bear that is in the right mood, and here's the thing, you never know what that bear just experienced. So it could have just been eating a seal and is fat and full and, you know, ready to take a nap, and it's just walking through on its way to go take that nap, and you happen to be there. You might just have to clap your hands or, you know, make a noise, or maybe not even do anything, and that bear is gonna go on by. Now let's say that a different bear is coming through and it hasn't eaten in a few weeks. Maybe it's well, these are particularly known to be troublesome bears, but maybe it is a young male polar bear that has just been kicked out by mom. So mom has just left. And so it's basically a teenage boy polar bear who now has to hunt for himself, and mom's been helping hunt this whole time. Turns out hunting by yourself is harder than hunting with mom. And these teenage boy polar bears kind of tend to think of themselves as being invincible. They're very curious. They're basically a recipe for human polar bear conflict. So let's say one of those is coming in and it hasn't eaten in about a month, and it's really hungry. So that bear is going to be a lot harder to deter than the first bear I described. And so you might need to use things like, you know, we think of the different senses a polar bear has. So light, sound, different smells you can use. So maybe revving a motor is kind of one step up from clapping your hands, or using a really high-powered spotlight to shine on the bear is a step up from turning on your porch lights. And then it goes all the way up through to some things that actually come into contact with the bear. So there are what's called colloquially non-lethal or less lethal ammunition that can be used, such as rubber slugs fired by a shotgun, or beanbag rounds, things that are designed to not be lethal, but are designed to pack a punch and really give that bear its negative experience.
Yeah,
So
the reality is that saves that bear's life. I know a lot of times
exactly.
when I'm guiding people in the Churchill area of Canada, they use very similar methodologies, but the reality is that if they hear a loud bang, we might be startled, we might say, oh, poor bear, but the reality is if that bear comes into town, if it barges into a house, that bear might have to get put down. So there's absolutely the safe way to go for the bear's well-being, honestly. So kind of switching gears a little bit, but staying with this idea of humans and wildlife living amongst one another. There's this term known as traditional ecological knowledge that I've always been fascinated with, and it's often abbreviated in the literature as TEK or LEK for local ecological knowledge. And it's this idea that yes, there are more humans living in bear habitat now than ever before, but there really have always been some sort of interchange. And so there could be hundreds and maybe even thousands of years of people passing down stories and knowledge from generation to generation of how to track polar bears, how to know when they're in the area, how to know how many are in the area. And these tools could be very valuable to science. Is this something that you use in your work?
Absolutely. And I think that the people who live with polar bears are the experts on polar bears, and especially the people who've been living with polar bears for thousands of years. As you said, here in Alaska, the Inuit have been coexisting and living as part of the same ecosystem with polar bears. And a lot of that knowledge has been passed down, and the people who are sometimes people use the term, traditional ecological knowledge. There's other terms that people like to use, like indigenous knowledge or Inuit knowledge, to show that it's all interconnected. It's not just ecological. There's a whole system of knowledge in place, and that is it's a very deep and well-tested way of knowing. And it's also answers different questions than might be posed to, say, Western science. However, some of the questions that we have today are not going to be answered by either one exclusively. And so bringing those together, and I think of it as probably the best way to do this, although that's a dangerous thing to say, but a good way to do this is have everybody working together from the beginning. So build trust, develop relationships between knowledge holders, indigenous knowledge holders, Western scientists, so that you can be sitting side by side and thinking, I wonder why that's happening, or what do we do, if we want to conserve this species, or we want to understand what's happening with the species so that we know what to do. And then think about how might we answer that question together in using both of these systems of knowing and knowledge to get at that answer. So I think from the very beginning, integrating the two and not having it be a comparison, but having it be really a collaboration leads us to the best knowledge and the best results. And that is incredibly important for doing conservation and really maintaining these amazing ecosystems.
Yeah, and when you think about it, I mean, really think about it, how to study a polar bear. It's tough. You are in really inhospitable conditions. Usually there's very little infrastructure, just, getting to the place, staying in the place, staying safe and healthy and sane. So it's really expensive. Very, very few people can do it and are able to do it. So relying on, you know, thousands of years of previous knowledge is just a no-brainer. I think it's such a great integration. It reminds me of one of the real key milestones along this 50-year pathway is, I believe in 2013, this group, these 5 nations got together and kind of re-upped their commitment, got back together. And one of the things that came out of it was this decree, for lack of a better word, like a real deal understanding that we will all share the latest information with one another. These 5 countries, Russia, US, Canada, Norway, Denmark, haven't always been super friendly, but as a scientific community, they agreed that they will always share the latest data and research because it's going to keep people and the polar bears safe. So I think that was a really, really great milestone as well.
Yeah.
Another cool milestone in the fight for polar bear conservation, in 2003, World Wildlife Fund initiated its tracking program. And I know that's something that you've been involved in. And I would love to hear a little bit about maybe your personal work, crusades, sort of the past, present, and future on this tracking program. And I will also say before I hand it back over to you, I do want to save some time for questions, because questions from the audience they're always very enlightening, and we want to make sure that we answer the things that are on your mind. So if you haven't yet submitted a question and you have something in your mind, please do submit via the chat field, and we'll make sure we carve out some time at the end to answer those together. But yeah, tracking, World Wildlife Fund tracking polar bears. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so that tracking program started before I joined WWF, and I think you have a link you can share for people to follow along on that. But one of the interesting things about tracking is the evolution of how we do it, and the technology that's available, and what works and what doesn't. So a cool story is some of the first trackers that were ever used, these radio telemetry collars, were actually invented in Alaska and first tested on polar bears, muskox, and I believe caribou were the other species. And so I was talking to some of the people who invented these radio telemetry devices, and then I was talking to people who use them, and turns out nobody likes these things. They don't work very well. They're cumbersome, they're clunky. Scientists don't like them. A lot of indigenous people don't like them. A lot of the public don't like them. And but they give us incredibly important information, and they're the only thing there. And the manufacturers have kind of a captive audience of there's only one place to go to buy your polar bear collars, and there's only so many scientists going to buy them on an annual basis. So we got a bunch of people together, from scientists, from zoos, from the existing manufacturers, and did basically a big workshop, big brainstorming session on what's wrong with the collars now, what does everyone not like, and what could we replace it with that would still give us that really valuable information, but would do away with some of the drawbacks of the collars. And so what we decided was an ear tag would be an ideal solution, or when I say ideal, it's a compromise. However, it's kind of exactly, it's a compromise that suits a lot of the players and would satisfy a lot of the things that a lot of the stakeholders really care about, and would give us the results. So we set out to make ear tags that would do a certain set of things. And I have learned a lot about research and development and innovation, mainly that you should triple your budget and the amount of time that you think it will take to make something new. Also, doing it in a global pandemic and supply chain crisis is not great for getting it done quickly. That said, where we're at right now is we solved two of the major challenges that were ahead of us for developing these ear tags. And one of those was we worked with a company in Canada who created a completely internal antenna for the device, because the antenna they had tried ear tags before, and there were a lot of failure points. One of those was this ear tag, and turns out if you put a whip antenna on a polar bear's ear, they do things like swim in the water, and then they come out and all the water goes to the end and freezes. So you got a nice little ice ball on the end. And then I like to imagine, you know, a polar bear might go into a den and there's cubs, and that ear tag, that is a great whip antenna, like a cat toy. Yeah, basically. So some of the, a lot of the devices, they never actually got back, so they just stopped receiving information from them. But the ones they did get back, usually there was an issue with the antenna, it was broken, or also it has to go inside the device and has to come out, which also creates an opening for potentially, you know, salt water in extreme temperatures, and electronics, they don't play very well together. So so we came up with a solution, developed it. It is actually out in open source. We published it on GitHub. All of the plans are there. And we are currently doing outreach to existing manufacturers and basically saying, here is an amazing solution. What we were not able to achieve is some of the attachment and kind of ergonomic aspects of the device, but we know that other people are working on that. And so right now we've come up with something that everybody wants, and we want other people who are working on these other aspects of it to come and take that for free, just get it into your devices and make it possible to get it out on polar bears. So that's where we're at right now.
Cool.
So if you manufacture satellite telemetry devices, give me a call.
Anyone out there, please do. Please let us know. So we're going to send that link out. It's a cool little online app, and you can literally track I think about a dozen polar bears and their movement around the Churchill area, a very well-known population known as the Western Hudson Bay, and also the population up by Svalbard and Spitsbergen. So it's kind of cool to see. But other than, you know, kind of entertaining folks like me at home to say, oh, the bears are still out on ice, that's cool. What value is it to you? Like, what data are you getting? What do you want to know about with these trackers?
So there's all sorts of things that you can learn from putting the devices out. Movement data is really interesting. Some of the collars, you can put different sensors on them. So a lot of these sensors are really tiny. They don't add a lot of weight, or they don't use a lot of energy. So, you know, for example, somebody has been studying energy use in polar bears. And so they've been looking at, can you put an accelerometer in this thing and have it basically be like a Fitbit on a polar bear? So you can look at how many calories they might be expending, and then look at different movement types in captive polar bears. And okay, well, this type of movement from this, let's call it a Fitbit, indicates that the polar bear might be hunting, or this movement means they might be resting, things like that. And so, as you were saying, most of the year, scientists don't see polar bears. They're not in polar bear habitat. And polar bears are also, I mean, they occupy this enormous range, and they're generally pretty solitary for most of the year. And so even if you are in polar bear habitat, you know, you're not looking at your window and seeing a herd of polar bears. So this allows us to get an idea for what they do the rest of the time when we're not there to observe them, and also
Very
where
cool.
they're going and how they're using the habitat.
Yeah, I love that. That's fantastic. Well, so one kind of final topic that has been woven in and out of these last 50 years, I think it's interesting. It's absolutely conservation. It's not necessarily science in these traditional ways like collars and tags and training of polar bear patrols and that sort of stuff, but it's this idea of tourism for polar bears. And it's something that we at NatHab believe is a major pillar in conservation, because it gets people to know and to love and to appreciate and to save these bears, both in the origin as well as the visitors. You know, the people that host the visitors get to add value, as well as the visitors. But what are your thoughts on polar bear tourism? Do you think that this has been beneficial for the bears throughout the last, you know, decades?
Yeah, I'm just gonna give a personal example. You know, it's not something that I study at a large scale, but I have been on the trips in Churchill, and sometimes I get to go and be the added entertainment for a group, which is always great. And the first time I was in Churchill, I had already been out accompanying some scientists in Alaska on a mercury capture. So in helicopters, darting polar bears, then you weigh them and take measurements and do all these things. But you only interact with the bear when it's terrified because you're chasing it in a helicopter and you're, you know, going to tranquilize it, or it's knocked out. So it's a very you're not interacting with it in a very neutral way, let's put it that way. And so it feels very much like we are going into polar bears territory and we are studying them very actively. And in Churchill, I was out on the tundra and was looking out and a polar bear came right up to the vehicle we were in, and I remember being at one of the windows and looking out, and the window is open, and this polar bear stands up on its hind legs, puts his paws on the side of the bus, or the sorry, not the bus, but the rover.
Rover, yeah.
Yes, and looks at me, and you know, I think in my memory we were eye to eye. I'm pretty sure it was further away, but in my memory I could see its eyes, and its eyes were studying me. So it made eye contact with me, and then it looked at my forehead. I could see it looked at my face, it looked at my shoulders, it looked at the camera I had, and it was kind of sniffing, and it inspected me for a good 30 seconds before it moved on and did the same thing to the next person. And I thought, oh, I am not studying this animal. This animal is studying me. And that was a very different experience. And really, you know, still gives me chills to think about it. And so I think personally, it's changed the way I think about polar bears. And I think that's a valuable thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it happens to so many people that we get to bring out on the tundra each and every year. There's a great saying that you cannot save what you do not love, and you cannot love what you do not know. And so I think getting people to know these things intimately or vicariously via people's photos and videos after the fact when friends and family see them is such an important part of the equation. So I think just like you said, this integration of traditional knowledge with scientific knowledge, I think tourism plays that big role in like weaving everything together to make this whole kind of tapestry of conservation. So that was a beautiful story, Elisabeth. So I think I would like to end my questions for you there and open it up to the audience and get some questions from folks that we can answer with our remaining time.
All right, thank you so much. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. With that, let's get to some of these questions. So, do you find that local communities are really open to working together with the scientific community?
Well, I would say no local community is a monolith. I'll put it that way. So there's it varies from community to community. It varies within communities, and I think what it really comes down to is in the places where both parties have put in the time and the effort to build trust, and create relationships that are not transactional, that are long term. Those are the places where it's most fruitful and where both sides really benefit from it. So there's an an encouraging trend of scientists wanting to put in that time and build that trust and make that possible. And so I'm encouraged about the possibilities there.
What about the areas where the locals aren't really interested in making peace with the polar bears? Do you have strategies for that?
Yeah, and I mean, it really depends on where you are. Here in Alaska, you know, there's management regulations on how people and polar bears can interact, and so if people want to handle it a certain way that might not be, you know, might not be saving every polar bear, that is their prerogative, and we are not going to go in and tell them that they are not allowed to do something that they are very much allowed to do. There are traditional methods for dealing with problem polar bears that are 100% effective. So if you take the life of the polar bear that is attacking you, that polar bear will not attack you again. People have lived with polar bears for a very, very long time. And in many places, it is in many cultures, it's a spiritual connection with polar bears. And as part of that connection is with hunting and using the entire animal for food, for clothing, for artwork, for a lot of different things. And that is something that ties those people to polar bears more strongly than anyone outside of that culture will be connected to polar bears. And so that tradition has a place in polar bear conservation. When I work with a community, the question I ask is, are there times where you want to protect the lives of people and also not take that polar bear for subsistence? And there usually are. There's times when people would prefer not to. And so it doesn't mean that every single time is going to be the same. But where there is that common, yes, there are instances where we need to keep people safe and we don't want to kill this bear. That's where I can help.
One of our guests traveled with Nat Hebb to Churchill last year and saw the polar bear jail there. Could you talk about how successful that has been?
Yeah, so Churchill is the one place in the world where that has this, and Churchill is in kind of an ideal situation for that. It's actually more connected, believe it or not, for people who've been there, it's more connected to the global south than really any other polar bear hotspot in the world, with that railway and the port, and has a lot of infrastructure from the military and from tourism. And so they have come up with this solution, or not solution, but a way of managing the issue. And there's certain polar bears are incredibly smart. I mean, it's astonishing, and a lot of indigenous belief systems say that polar bears are as intelligent as people, and when you spend time watching them, it really feels that way. And so the ones who learn how to get what they want from people usually come back and do it again and find new clever ways to get around some of the obstacles that people put up for them. So in Churchill, they call these the problem bears. And some of them are fairly well known. They're distinctive animals. Some of them have names, I think, that are people have just kind of given them over the years. And so you know when that one shows up. And as soon as they start causing trouble, you know that if you deter it, it doesn't matter. It's going to come back. It's going to be a problem. And like you said, Court, that's usually a death sentence for a bear, any species of bear that is a repeat offender. And so to avoid that, they basically take this polar bear and put it in an enclosure in kind of looks like a warehouse, and they provide water for the bear, but that's about it. So it's not a pleasant experience. I think that might be where the term jail came in. But it's also not going to impact the health of the bear. Polar bears are built for feast and famine. They don't need to eat. They're probably not eating very much during that time of year anyway. But there's nowhere for them to go that's not going to be a problem for people because there's no ice at that time of year. And so putting them in this holding facility and waiting until there is ice, and then taking them, and you may have seen some videos or photos of these helicopters where they'll put the polar bear in a net and pick it up with a helicopter and fly it out. Some of those solutions can happen after the sea ice forms, and then that bear can be released because it probably would rather be out on the ice hunting seals, but until there's ice, it's not able to do that, and it's probably going to be coming into contact with people.
So given the increase in tourism in Churchill, number of people, and the tundra buggies, do we know what impact that has had on polar bears?
You know, I'm going to turn that over to Court because I am not as well versed as I'm sure you are on that one.
Yeah, so it's a hard question to answer directly because there's a bit of well, there's the hard numbers. You can do population counts and census, but then there's the philosophy of the people. I've heard at one point, you know, several thousand people each year being positively impacted by seeing polar bears, meaning like these are visitors that get out and their lives are kind of changed because this is often a big bucket list item for folks. But it's hard to measure that, and it's something that I've always been keen to study and understand a little bit more about. There are some new papers out about like the impact of wildlife and evaluation of tourism and what we call like a willingness to pay study. In fact, a few years ago, Canada did a study of what the average citizen is willing to pay annually for polar bears to remain alive. And collectively, the country of Canada, via these studies, every single person, it's a huge, long, peer-reviewed paper, were willing to pay $508 per household per year to keep polar bears alive, which amounts to $6.3 billion per year. And that turns out to be about $420,000 per bear per year. That's the value that Canadians place on their own polar bears. So it's really a national symbol. It's a beloved animal. But it's hard to measure that beyond some of these willingness to pay studies. You have to know that it is doing a world of good by exposing people to the natural world because of what I said before. You cannot say what you do not love, cannot love what you do not know. So if you know your apathy is the biggest danger here, right? And this is anti-apathy. So you know there's a good thing there. In terms of the impact on bears, I've been on a lot of rovers, a lot of days, on a lot of trips up there. And I can tell you there's a code of ethics amongst every single vehicle, every operator up there that, you know, you don't push a bear, you don't get in the way, you are a feature on the tundra. And just like Elisabeth said, you know, we're positioning ourselves not to go out and really search and find bears and study them. We're placing ourselves in the ideal areas for polar bears to find us. And because this is a population of anywhere from 600 to 1,000 in a given year, you know, you're seeing this migration of polar bears. So just sitting there and kind of doing a little bit of meandering, you get access and encounters with many, many bears. So I think the impact is extremely low. The roads that are used by the polar rovers are old military roads, so it's not actively going over new or fresh or sensitive tundra environments. And so, you know, you have this huge, huge vantage point, and these bears are moving. These bears are essentially just kind of waiting out the time over the course of October, November until the sea ice is deformed. So I would say, you know, the increase in tourism, because it's managed very well and still very small scale compared to really any other wildlife tourism, like tigers in India or Africa. I mean, those are also managed well, but they're much, much larger scale. I see the impact being very minimal and the positive impact being very maximal.
Great, thanks for addressing that, Court. So what is it about the Arctic that makes it a great place for polar bears? Why aren't there polar bears in Antarctica, for instance?
Yet. No, kidding.
Well, I mean, there were never polar bears in Antarctica, and that's a very long way to walk. So I think that's probably the answer I would give about why there aren't polar bears there. They are very well suited, and as Court said at the beginning of the webinar, you know, polar bears filled a niche in this environment, and they became the apex predator, and they fill that niche today. And so they are an integral part of the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is very well suited to their needs.
Yeah, and kind of just to riff off of that one, so it's a great question, and I think it's one of those things that like you could start an entire college semester with that question and teach every bit of like island biogeography and evolution with just that one question, because it's a fantastic question as a staging point for like kind of all of like, well, why aren't bears in the southern hemisphere? Why? Oh, because they have to migrate through extraordinarily different thermoclines, very different temperatures and humidity levels, and that comes down to different prey items, and the adaptation and the generation span dictates adaptation. So it's not that they couldn't survive down there, like, you know, life evolves and moves on and figures stuff out, but literally you'd have to take like 200 bears and drop them off somewhere, just see what happens in 20,000 years.
I would imagine it would be very bad for the rest of the ecosystem on Antarctica if you put some polar bears there. Like, yeah. I can't imagine a bunch of penguins surviving that.
Oh yeah. And then you also have the other part of it that like actually leopard seals kind of occupy the same niche. So then you have leopard seals competing with polar bears, and it's like, oh man, put those in a cage match and see what happens. Like but it's a brilliant question. But it really comes down to the fact that when you look at the biodiversity of bears in the northern hemisphere versus southern, they just never moved south. You know, the cats of Asia have moved between Africa, but it's all in like very similar habitat, very similar temperature and flora systems, and so they can sort of move over the course of hundreds of thousands and millions of years. But yeah, going north to south, there's a great book, if you haven't read it, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, that really talks about this intersection of north to south movement in life, humans, wildlife, disease, culture, everything. North to south movement, very, very, very tough. East to west movement, super easy and happens all the time. Has been happening for millions of years. And that kind of, in 612 pages, it'll answer that question. It is a great question, though.
It is very interesting as climate change is progressing and we're seeing species move north. We are seeing some other apex predators move in, and that is the orca, the killer whales. And so it's the ecosystem is responding to some of these new top predators in Alaska, and it's very interesting to see that play out.
Great. Well, thank you both. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you guys for your closing comments.
Just thank you, and it's always so great to talk with you. And I am heading back to Churchill this year. I'm so excited to see the polar bears again. So thanks, Court.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for everyone in the audience. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Elizabeth, and kind of showcasing some knowledge about conservation over the last 50 years. I will, of course, invite you to see polar bears on your own up in Churchill if that's something that you have not done and then you're interested in doing. Shameless plug, I will be guiding a very special polar bear trip this November 12th. And I know I just checked and we do still have space at certain points throughout the season and also on that departure. So I'd love to see you. We'll talk all about conservation and polar bears and all sorts of Arctic ecology and fun stuff, and we'll see bears. That's always a highlight. And yeah, it's just been a pleasure being here today, and thanks for hanging in there.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.